The Little Fairy. From a book of old-fashioned fairy tales and fables by Chuma Ikenze. Once upon a time, there lived a little fairy who loved to dance with her fairy sisters. They danced in a meadow where there was an old elderberry tree on whose branches were cut all kinds of love symbols. The fairies knew that it was dangerous to dance in this meadow because many fairies had lost their veils while dancing by this particular elderberry tree. Yet, the attraction was too strong to resist. The pleasure they got from dancing under this tree made them feel it was worth the risk. The moon usually watched with a brilliant, radiant smile, which reflected throughout the night sky as the fairies danced. Some say that the moon comes out only to watch fairies dancing at night, and that the nights with the brightest and fullest moon have the most number of fairies dancing. Will-o'-the-wisps could also be seen dancing in the air alongside the fairies. One night, after the fairy sisters had finished dancing, they skipped back merrily to where they had carefully hidden their veils while they danced. The rule was that fairies were not allowed to wear their veils while dancing, but no one knew why. That was just the way things were. Another rule was that no fairy was allowed to live in fairyland without a veil. Again, no one knew why. But the fairies were happy to live by that rule too. After a lovely night of dancing in the brilliant moonlight, the happy but tired sisters went to put on their veils before going back home. To their surprise, they found only 11 veils. One veil was missing, the one belonging to the youngest of the 12 sisters. This meant that she could not return home if she did not have her veil. All 12 sisters were very worried by the loss. They began an intensive search of the area, looking for the missing veil. They looked in every nook and cranny, but found nothing. They thought of asking the moon if she had seen or taken the missing veil, but they reconsidered because the veil would be useless to the moon. The little fairy's veil would be too small to cover the moon's face. They thought also of asking the will-o'-the-wisps about the missing veil, but they had all been too busy dancing with the fairies and could not have sneaked away to take the veil. Besides, the veil would have been too heavy for the biggest will-o'-the-wisp because a will-o'-the-wisp is, after all, nothing but fluorescent water vapor. Since there were no other creatures in sight to ask, the fairies conducted another round of frantic search with growing desperation. They knew that they would have to return home as soon as dawn broke. With daybreak, more humans would be around and about, and that could be very dangerous for fairies, even though they did not know why. As the sunlight increased, it became clear that the youngest of the fairies would have to be left behind. Fairy custom forbade the fairies from thinking of sneaking their sister back into fairyland, nor would tradition allow them to endanger themselves by staying with her. That would be wrong self-sacrifice for someone else's carelessness. Losing a veil was considered the height of carelessness among fairies, and these sisters knew the danger from taking their veils off, especially outside of their home in fairyland. After putting on their veils, the 11 fairies hugged their youngest sister. The sun had fully appeared above the horizon, so the other sisters left with much sorrow and regret. The moon and the will-o'-the-wisps had already retired to their own homes. The little fairy was now all alone and more afraid. She hid inside the petals of a nearby rose bush and cried quietly. Soon, a brightly colored butterfly that was out early to gather pollen from flowers noticed her hiding and crying. When he came closer and saw her without her veil, he knew something bad had happened. The butterfly called out to the little fairy, "My dear, what happened? The moon is no longer shining, and I can see that you are not wearing your veil. Something awful must have happened for you to be away from fairyland at this time of day." The little fairy narrated, in between sobs, the sad tale of how she could not find her veil. She told the butterfly about the fruitless searches she and her sisters had conducted for the missing veil. After a moment of silence, the butterfly asked her exactly how far they had searched for the missing veil. She replied that they had searched far and wide in every nook and cranny of the veil where they had been dancing. "But," suggested the butterfly, "could the wind have picked up and blown your veil to another veil? Perhaps I can help you search in the next veil." At that suggestion, hope swelled in the little fairy, But she had not slept all night and was too weary to fly to the next vale. The butterfly continued, "I know you have wings, but I suspect that you are too weak from all that crying and sadness to fly by yourself. Hop on my back, and we will fly to the next vale together." The little fairy was relieved. Thanking him, she climbed onto his back. Then the butterfly took off downwind to the next vale. When they arrived, they started another frantic and desperate search for the missing vale. Again, they had no luck. The butterfly then suggested that perhaps they should try the vale even further down. What did the veilless fairy have to lose? She agreed and was very grateful for the butterfly's kindness. This time, the butterfly flew upwind to the next vale. Upon arriving there, they carried out another round of searching for the missing vale. But even here, they had no luck. It was now approaching noon, and it was time for the butterfly to return home. He had left home early that morning to collect pollen for his wife to bake pollen cake for the family supper. Making pollen cake was an intricate, time-consuming business. The process had to start no later than midday if the family hoped to eat pollen cake for supper that day. The butterfly could not disappoint his family or make them go without food for the night. After all, the missing veil may have been a result of the carelessness of the little fairy. Though he did not say anything about her carelessness, the butterfly explained to her why it was time for him to head home. During their searches among the different types of flowers, the butterfly had filled his pouch with pollen. His wife would be very pleased with him. He was sure that the assortment of pollen would make this the best pollen cake ever. As the butterfly was about to bid the little fairy farewell and good luck with her continued search, it occurred to him to invite her to join him and his family for the rest of the day. The sun was now high in the sky, and humans were around and about. This meant that the little fairy was exposed to even more danger. The butterfly felt that she would be safe with his family, and she could continue her search again at night, when there would be fewer humans around. Also, he would speak to his cousins, the moths, to see if they would be willing to assist during the nighttime search. The little fairy did not wish to be left alone again. She was very tired and had no idea where else to search for the missing veil, so she gladly accepted the butterfly's offer and went home with him. The butterfly children were happy to have a visitor and couldn't wait for the opportunity to play with the little fairy. But the butterfly's wife took immediate pity on the little fairy after she heard her story. The wife suggested that the little fairy should get some well-deserved rest. Then the wife started baking the pollen cake because time was running out. But first, she turned to the butterfly children and issued a warning. "Let our visitor rest. Anyone who disturbs her will have his or her ration of pollen cake reduced." The threat of reduced pollen cake did the trick. Not one of the butterfly children wanted to risk that. The butterfly arranged a bed made out of freshly dried leaves and straw in the corner of the nest and invited the little fairy to rest and recuperate. As soon as she rested her head on the cozy bed, she fell into a deep sleep. During her sleep, the fairy dreamed that she saw her missing veil floating in the sky. It looked like the faintest wisp of a cloud. She also saw many other fairy veils floating in the sky. Occasionally, they gathered into thicker wisps of clouds. At other times, they separated and floated along on their own. Strangely, though there were many veils floating in the sky, the fairy could always tell which was her own, even when it was part of a wisp of clouds. As she stared at the veils doing their dances, a face appeared in the sky. It looked like a fairy woman. She had the most beautiful face the little fairy had ever seen. Her eyes gave evidence of a depth of wisdom and happiness that the little fairy had never seen, not even in fairyland. But even more shocking was that this beautiful and wise fairy woman was not wearing a veil. From the look on the little fairy's face, the fairy woman could see all the emotions and questions that were coursing through the little fairy's head. That was enough for her to explain to the little fairy the nature of her experience with her missing veil and the meaning of her dream. It turned out that the little fairy's missing veil was not a result of her carelessness after all. The fairy woman explained that all the veils the little fairy saw floating in the sky belonged to fairies, like herself, who had been selected for a special mission. Their mission was to approach humans. They were to awaken humans' long-lost memories of the days when they communicated and worked more closely with fairies and other creatures. The woman explained that veils made it more difficult for humans to see fairies. Without their veils hiding them, it was hoped that humans would be able to see these fairies again, and with that, perhaps make it easier for humans to see again with their inner eyes. The fairies selected for this task were making a great sacrifice, as they were denied entry to fairyland during their period of assignment. However, the reward for the sacrifice was also very great. Only the strongest and purest of fairies were selected for this task, because it required patience. They also needed a strong resolve not to forget fairyland, just as humans had forgotten their unseen environment and eternal homeland. She then told the little fairy that any fairy who succeeded in their assignment could look forward to reuniting with their veil. By then, the veil would have been transformed into a dainty crown of exquisite colors to serve as a prize for their sacrifice. With that explanation, the little fairy became quite relieved that she had not been careless with her veil after all. It crossed her mind, too, that the butterfly had been on the right track with his suggestion that the wind might have picked up and blown her veil away. But the butterfly had not suspected how high up the veil had been lifted. The little fairy then asked the wise fairy woman, "Please, can you tell me how I can fulfill my assignment?" "Yes," said the fairy woman. "There are different ways. Some choose to approach humans who have a true and deep love for flowers and plants. They try to influence their thinking on how to grow, treat, and care for plants. Others choose to approach those who have a true and deep love for animals, to influence them on the proper care and respect for animals. This respect includes allowing animals to be as nature intended for them, and not to try to impose human traits on them. A few choose to approach and influence poets, but they can only influence poets who write uplifting stories that turn the gaze of humans upwards, poems and stories that support and build nobility of character." As the wise woman finished speaking, the little fairy felt a gentle nudge on her shoulder. It was one of the butterfly children. She had come to fetch her for the delicious supper of pollen cake. The meal was served on little green leaves. The little fairy relished the pollen cake. It was accompanied by the sweetest flower nectar the fairy had ever tasted. No doubt everything tasted much better because she was relieved now that she understood what had happened to her. Of course, she would miss her family in fairyland. But she knew that until her reunion with her veil, she would have to adopt the creatures of Earth as her new family and would have to work hard to get through to at least one human. She had also learned that every misfortune has something of value hidden inside, just as the saying, "There is a silver lining to every dark cloud." She had decided that she would work to influence humans who loved flowers, not only because she loved flowers, but it would give her the opportunity to work closely with her new butterfly friend, whose entire family loved flowers, even his cousins, the moths, who loved nighttime blossoms. The butterfly noted the relief and happiness of the little fairy and was eager to find out the reason for the transformation. But he decided he would wait until after they had finished supper to find out what had caused the change in her, especially since she still had no veil, and that was enough to keep any fairy very sad until she had found her veil again.